On the morning of June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in human history was already underway. But for thousands of soldiers packed inside small landing craft heading toward the coast of France, the scale of the operation meant little compared to the fear of what awaited them in the next few minutes. The mission was part of Operation Overlord, the massive Allied plan to open a Western front against Nazi Germany and begin the liberation of Western Europe. More than 150,000 Allied troops would land across the beaches of Normandy that day, supported by thousands of ships and aircraft. The invasion itself would later be remembered simply as D-Day. Yet among all the landing zones assigned to Allied forces, one particular beach stood out as the most dangerous and uncertain. That stretch of sand was known as Omaha Beach. Even before the invasion began, Allied planners had serious concerns about this sector. Unlike other beaches in Normandy, Omaha was bordered by steep cliffs and high bluffs that overlooked the shoreline. Those heights provided German defenders with a perfect vantage point from which they could observe and fire upon any soldiers attempting to land below. The terrain meant that the attacking troops would have to cross a wide-open beach with very little cover before reaching the base of the cliffs. Worse still, only a handful of narrow roads and paths led inland from the beach, meaning that if German forces held those exits, the Allied troops could become trapped on the shoreline with nowhere to go. The German defenses in this area formed part of a massive defensive network stretching across the western coastline of Europe known as the Atlantic Wall. Adolf Hitler had ordered the construction of this system in an attempt to prevent exactly the type of invasion the Allies were now launching. Along the Normandy coastline, German engineers had spent months building reinforced bunkers, artillery positions, and machine gun nests designed to dominate the beaches below. At Omaha Beach, these fortifications were particularly strong. Concrete bunkers had been embedded into the cliffs themselves, making them extremely difficult to destroy from the air or from naval bombardment. Machine guns were positioned so that their fire overlapped across the entire shoreline, meaning that any soldier stepping onto the beach would immediately be exposed to deadly crossfire. Fields of mines were buried in the sand and along the cliffs, while metal obstacles were placed in the shallow water to destroy landing craft and slow the advance of tanks and infantry. Defending this sector was the experienced 352nd Infantry Division, a battle-hardened German unit composed largely of veteran soldiers. These men had been stationed in the area for months and knew the terrain extremely well. They had studied the beach carefully and had precise firing ranges already calculated for their machine guns and artillery pieces. When Allied bombers and warships began bombarding the coastline in the early hours of June 6, the German defenders quickly took cover inside their fortified bunkers. The bombardment was intended to destroy or weaken the defenses before the landings began, but poor weather conditions and visibility caused many bombs to fall too far inland. As a result, when the smoke cleared, most of the German defensive positions were still intact and ready for battle. Meanwhile, far out in the English Channel, hundreds of landing craft were moving steadily toward the Normandy coastline. Inside those small boats were American soldiers assigned to assault Omaha Beach in the first wave of the invasion. Many of them were young men who had never experienced combat before. They sat shoulder to shoulder on narrow benches, gripping their rifles while waves slammed against the metal hulls of the boats. The sea was rough that morning, and many soldiers were already seasick from the violent motion of the craft. Others stared silently at the metal ramp in front of them, knowing that in a few minutes it would drop and expose them directly to enemy fire. Each soldier carried heavy equipment including ammunition, grenades, medical kits, and rations. Some packs weighed more than 30 kilograms. If a soldier fell into deep water while wearing that equipment, the weight could easily drag him beneath the surface. As the landing craft approached the shore, the soldiers could begin to see the dark outline of the cliffs rising above the beach. Naval gunfire from Allied warships thundered overhead, sending massive shells crashing into the hillsides and defensive positions along the coast. The explosions shook the ground and sent clouds of smoke into the air. Yet despite the intensity of the bombardment, many German bunkers remained operational. Hidden behind thick concrete walls and layers of earth, machine gun crews waited for the moment the landing craft would reach the shoreline. When the first boats finally reached the shallow waters near Omaha Beach, the battle began almost instantly. As the landing craft scraped against the sand and the ramps dropped open, German machine guns erupted from the cliffs above. Bullets tore across the front of the boats before many soldiers even had time to move. The men standing closest to the ramp were often the first to fall. Some collapsed inside the boats, while others fell directly into the water. Those who managed to jump into the surf quickly realized how difficult it was to move while carrying so much equipment. Some soldiers stumbled into deeper water than expected and disappeared beneath the waves, dragged down by the weight of their gear. Others struggled forward through the surf while bullets struck the water around them. Within minutes, the entire beach became a scene of chaos. Artillery shells exploded along the shoreline, throwing sand and debris into the air. Machine gun fire swept across the open sand in deadly bursts. Soldiers attempted to move forward but found almost no cover anywhere on the beach. Many dove behind the metal obstacles placed by German engineers to block vehicles and landing craft. Others crawled into craters created by explosions, pressing themselves into the sand while trying to avoid the relentless gunfire from above. Entire units quickly lost their officers in the opening moments of the battle, leaving soldiers disoriented and unsure of what to do next. For a time, it appeared that the assault on Omaha Beach might completely fail. The German defenders held the high ground and had clear lines of fire across the entire shoreline. Any attempt to advance across the open beach was met with devastating machine gun fire. Some soldiers remained pinned down for long periods, unable to move more than a few meters without drawing enemy fire. The carefully planned assault formations dissolved into scattered groups of men struggling simply to survive. Yet despite the chaos and confusion, small acts of initiative began to emerge among the soldiers trapped on the beach. Instead of waiting for orders that might never arrive, small groups of men began organizing themselves and looking for ways to move forward. Some crawled slowly along the shoreline, using destroyed equipment and shell craters for cover. Others moved toward the base of the cliffs, searching for any natural path that might lead upward. Eventually, a few soldiers discovered narrow gullies and steep ravines cutting through the bluffs. These rough paths offered a dangerous but possible route to reach the high ground where the German defenders were positioned. Climbing those slopes was extremely difficult. The ground was uneven and covered with loose rocks and grass. Enemy fire still swept across many of the approaches, forcing soldiers to move slowly and carefully. But reaching the top of the cliffs offered one crucial advantage. The German bunkers had been designed primarily to fire downward toward the beach below. Their main weapons faced the shoreline, not the rear. This meant that if American soldiers could reach the top of the bluffs, they might be able to attack the defensive positions from behind. Gradually, the first small groups of soldiers managed to reach the high ground overlooking the beach. From there they began moving carefully toward the German bunkers that had been firing on the landing forces below. Using grenades, rifles, and small unit tactics, they started attacking the defensive positions one by one. Machine gun crews that had dominated the beach earlier in the morning suddenly found themselves under attack from unexpected directions. Some bunkers were destroyed with explosives. Others were abandoned as German soldiers retreated to secondary positions further inland. As more American soldiers reached the top of the cliffs, the balance of the battle slowly began to shift. Each destroyed machine gun nest meant fewer bullets raining down onto the beach. The troops still pinned down near the shoreline started noticing that some enemy guns had fallen silent. That gave them the opportunity to move forward and search for paths leading up the bluffs themselves. Reinforcements continued arriving from the sea, bringing fresh soldiers and additional equipment onto the beach. By midday, the situation had begun to change dramatically. What had started as a near disaster slowly turned into a determined advance inland. American soldiers on the high ground began opening routes through the German defenses, allowing more troops to leave the exposed beach behind and push into the countryside beyond the cliffs. German defenders continued fighting fiercely, but their positions were gradually being overwhelmed by the growing number of Allied troops reaching the top of the bluffs. By the end of the day, Allied forces had successfully secured a foothold at Omaha Beach. The victory had come at a terrible cost. Thousands of soldiers had been killed or wounded during the brutal fighting of those first hours. Yet capturing Omaha Beach was essential to the success of the entire invasion. Without securing that beach, Allied forces landing at other sectors might have been isolated or exposed to German counterattacks. Yet the battle for Normandy was far from over. What had been achieved on the sands of Omaha Beach during those brutal first hours was only the beginning of a much larger and more complex struggle. The soldiers who had fought their way off the beach now faced a new and unfamiliar battlefield inland. The countryside of Normandy was unlike anything many American troops had seen before. Instead of wide open terrain, the landscape was divided by thick hedgerows, narrow dirt roads, and small farming fields separated by dense walls of vegetation known as bocage. These natural barriers created a maze-like battlefield where visibility was extremely limited, and enemy soldiers could easily hide just a few meters away without being seen. As American units pushed inland from Omaha Beach, they quickly discovered that German forces were still determined to resist. Many defenders who had retreated from the coastal bunkers regrouped in the villages and hedgerow fields beyond the cliffs. Small groups of German soldiers established defensive positions along narrow roads and inside farmhouses, turning the countryside into a patchwork of ambush points and strongholds. Progress became slow and dangerous. Tanks that had finally reached the shore struggled to maneuver through the tight lanes bordered by thick hedges. Infantry units had to clear one field at a time, often advancing only a few hundred meters during an entire day of fighting. Despite these difficulties, the Allied command understood that securing the beachhead was critical. The success of Operation Overlord depended on rapidly expanding the area controlled by Allied troops before German reinforcements could arrive in overwhelming numbers. Supplies, vehicles, artillery, and additional soldiers were constantly landing along the Normandy beaches. Every hour that the Allies maintained control of the coastline allowed more troops to enter the battle. German commanders were well aware of the danger posed by the Allied landings. Units stationed across northern France began moving toward Normandy in an attempt to contain the invasion before it could grow too large. However, confusion within the German command delayed the full deployment of reinforcements. Some leaders believed the Normandy assault might only be a diversion, expecting the main invasion somewhere else along the coast. Meanwhile, the soldiers who had survived the deadly landings continued advancing through the hedgerow countryside. Field by field and village by village, Allied troops slowly expanded their foothold in France. The fighting remained intense, but the momentum of the invasion was beginning to shift. Air superiority allowed Allied aircraft to attack German convoys and reinforcements attempting to reach the front. Weeks later, after continuous fighting across Normandy, Allied forces finally managed to break through the remaining German defensive lines. Once that breakthrough occurred, the road across France opened. The invasion that had begun with chaos and uncertainty on the sands of Omaha Beach had grown into a massive offensive, pushing toward the liberation of Western Europe. Today, the beach itself is quiet and peaceful. Waves roll gently across the sand where thousands of soldiers once fought and died. Visitors walk along the shoreline, often unaware of how close the invasion came to failure during those first terrifying hours of D-Day. Yet the courage and determination shown there ensured that the invasion would succeed, opening the road to the liberation of Europe and helping change the course of the Second World War forever.